Okay, answering more asks about Team Delusional and Bethyl. By the way, guys, if during these last few videos, I'm kind of recording them all at once, if you hear whimpering and what sounds like a cowbell, I don't know if my microphone is picking that up, but it's just my stepmom's dog. She's wandering around, and she's one of those dogs that when my stepmom leaves and goes somewhere without her, the world is ending. So she's whimpering and milking it for all it's worth, and she keeps getting up and walking around. So if you hear what sounds like a cowbell, that's what it is. It's just my dog. Her name's Minnie, and she's sad because my stepmom left without her on an errand. So, okay, anyway. Okay, so I know it was Norman Reedus' idea to switch Daryl from cutting to burning himself in them, but the implications of that, if he didn't switch, him using Beth's knife to do it, that would have been the most tragic thing. How do you feel about the change? It doesn't change much of anything overall. He still self-harms, but from a writing perspective, where would you have landed on that decision? I mean, I think I would have preferred the knife just because the symbolism lines up better. We always said that when they do their Never Have I Ever game in Still, everything he says he's never done, he's going to end up doing. Okay, so he said he'd never been out of Georgia, and just a few episodes after Coda, he left Georgia with the rest of the group, right? And that's why some of those are really, really interesting. But at one point, he says, as a way to lash out at her, he says, I've never cut my wrist looking for attention. And then he would have ended up cutting himself. So it just would have been a fulfillment of what he said and a matching up of the symbolism more. So I do think I would have preferred that. I didn't mind the burning. I still thought it was really sad and really tragic. I remember watching that with my sisters and just feeling like, oh, this sucks. It's so sad that he's in so much pain, that he's harming himself like that. It's just tragic. And I think that, if I remember right, the reason they did it that way is because they wanted it to be very plain that he was doing that and he was crying because they wanted it to be plain that there was psychological pain there, and they just thought that it would be more effective to do the burn. And I think people kind of made fun of it either way. I do remember reading something, and it was clearly from someone who didn't like Beth and Daryl together. So it might have been a caroler or just another person in the fandom. But they said they were like trying to deny that he was grieving for Beth. And they were saying he wasn't crying because Beth died. He was crying because he burned himself with a cigarette. I mean, I laughed at that, but I was like, no, he's not. You know, we all know that's not the case. You're just being an idiot. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but I think overall I would have preferred the knife just from the symbolism perspective. But you're right that overall it didn't really change anything. And so it didn't bother me all that much that they did it that way. But I do think it's interesting that they specifically told us that it was originally supposed to be cutting, because they wanted us to make sure that in our minds we were aligning those two things, that, you know, Beth cut herself and then Daryl was going to cut himself. That was the plan, and then they changed it. So I always say that when they do something like that, when something changes and it doesn't make sense, they go out of their way to explain it to us. They did that in Consumed when the van went off the bridge with Daryl and Carol in it, and then it ended up on all fours instead of on its nose. They did a whole thing in The Talking Dead where they talked about that, and they're like, yeah, we know it didn't make sense. We know the physics weren't quite there, but this is why we only had so much time to do it, and this is just the way we had to do it. And the reason that I always point that out is because it goes to show so much more that it's odd that they never explained all the weirdness about Coda. It didn't make sense that Dawn would have shot Beth. Like, we all know that. When the bullet goes off, Dawn's gun is still in her holster. She pulls it out, and so by the time Beth falls, she's holding it. But if you watch really carefully, that gun is still in her holster when the bullet hits Beth. I mean, there's no way that it was her that shot Beth. And everybody says that she's the one who accidentally shot her. That's in all the reports. And if there was something like that didn't make sense, they would come out and explain it to us why they did it that way. And they haven't. They've been absolutely silent about that. And that is exactly what makes us realize that something else is going on there. So anyway, sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent. So I hope I answered your question about them. All right, next one. Right now, I'm just preparing for Daryl and Isabel to be a thing. 105 kind of sealed it for me with him being so close to Laurent and Laurent saying, we'll all be together again soon. I love Bethyl, but I'm just being realistic here. Thoughts on them going forward. I just disagree. I don't think that they're going to be a romantic thing. I mean, think about it this way. I do agree with you when you say that Laurent said, we'll all be together again, and that's a foreshadowing. But in that very episode, they were all together again. So it was a foreshadowing, and then it happened. That doesn't necessarily mean that Daryl and Isabel are going to be together romantically. I mean, we could be looking at possibly him leaving France, going back to the States, and taking them both with him if they want to go with him. But again, I think that would still be as just Isabel being his friend and wanting to come with him. You know what I mean? In the same way that Carol might want to come with him. It doesn't necessarily lead to romance. So, of course, we'll all just have to wait and see, but I'm not at all worried about Daryl and Isabel being a thing. I think they've really gone out of their way to tell us that's not where they're going with it. So, yeah, those are my thoughts. Next one. I'm trying to say your name. Hella Homo. I love the alliteration there. Okay. Hey, sorry if you've already covered this, but do you think that the story Daryl told about Jimmy and Beth's ex-boyfriend Jimmy are at all connected? The story was obviously very personal to Daryl and most likely happened to either himself or Merle. I'd love your insights on this. I don't know that I would say the story itself is connected to Jimmy, but I think that the writers of The Walking Dead use duplicate names very intentionally. And we've seen it quite a few times before. Sometimes they comment on it and sometimes they don't. For example, we had Bob, who Sasha was with romantically. And then after he died, I always call him Evil Officer Bob. He was actually Officer Lamson. And there's quite a few articles about why there were two Bobs and why they used that same name. And I don't necessarily think any of the articles got it right because most of them were very looking at surface level things. They weren't looking at the deeper symbolism. I think it had a lot to do with the fact that Sasha was still grieving for Bob, and the fact that this man shared his name made her vulnerable to him in a way that was not good. And then he took advantage of her to get away. And that almost directly led to what happened with Beth, because without Lamson, they only had two hostages to trade rather than three. And if they had had three, Dawn would not have been able to ask for Noah to stay. So the way that it played out was really intentional, and those names were the same. Some of the other places we've seen it is there have been several Sams. There have been more than one Isabel, and the other one is not in the regular flagship show. Sit down, Minnie. Sit. Good girl. The other one is in Fear the Walking Dead. Al, her love interest is named Isabel. So we've seen a couple of those. So, I mean, all I'm saying is I think that they did use the name Jimmy specifically, maybe to invoke Beth, because that is a name that we know from her past and from Herschel's farm. And Daryl did know Jimmy. I don't think he was particularly close to him, didn't really interact with him a lot, but it's interesting that he picked that name. So I think there is a connection, but I don't know that the story itself is connected to Jimmy. I think the story is 100% about Daryl and his past, or, it could be about Merle, but either way, it's from Daryl's past. But I think that the writers intentionally did use that name. So, all right. I think this is the last one that I have for now. But don't worry, I'm sure there will be more. One thing that will always bug me and make me think Beth is alive is the damn sheriff's hat. Rick, Carl, and Judith all wore it and got shot and lived. Beth is literally the only character to wear that damn hat. The only other character, to wear that damn hat. Some will say Rick put it on her to foreshadow her being on her own in season 5, but come on, she's now part of the You Get Shot and Lived club. It makes sense unless they decided to scrap everything while filming season 5. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And you're right, I hadn't thought about that Judith has become that now too. So yeah, I mean, that's, in terms of patterns, that's, you really can't deny that. I mean, all three of them got shot and lived, and Beth wore the hat and got shot, and everything points to her living. We just haven't actually seen it yet. And as I talked about before, I'd never bought into that they scrapped everything in season 5. The thing is, The Walking Dead doesn't do that. They really don't just scrap storylines that way. I mean, think about it. They brought Morales back after 8 seasons so that we could have closure on his storyline. Even though it was only for a minute, he was never a mainstream character. They still brought him back so that we could have closure on that. If they are waiting until after season 1 to show Beth because they want Carol to be there in order to line up with the symbolism from season 5 where Daryl and Carol are together. Think about that. They go out of their way to make sure that everything lines up and that all of the stories have a good closure to them. I mean, there's story after story after story like this. If somebody wants to be written out, they will write that person out. They will respect the actor's opinion and things. I mean, when it comes to if they want to leave the show, they'll let them leave the show. But they also make sure to write them a good ending so that they're being written out in a way that works as a closure for their character. And nothing about Beth's storyline was closed. I mean, there's so many odds and ends and open pieces that there's no way it's closed. There's no way they would leave it like that. So, yeah, I completely agree about the sheriff's hat. That's a really good point. And, yeah, I think it just kind of proves that she's still alive and kicking somewhere. We just haven't seen her yet. So, all right, I'm going to call it there for today because that's the last of the asks in my inbox for right now. But by the time this video goes live, I think we'll only be a day from episode 6. And I did have somebody send me an article the other day that said that there will be some jaw-dropping moments in episode 6. Obviously, we don't know what they are, but here's hoping for what we want to see. All right, see you guys soon.